Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Michael Del Castillo, Senior Editor at Forbes, where I help oversee our blockchain and cryptocurrency coverage. Here with Michael Gronager, the co-founder and CEO of Chainalysis, an OG crypto investigation and analysis firm, most recently valued at $8.6 billion. And for our audience that doesn't know, some high-profile clients have included over the years the U.S. Department of Justice and the IRS. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you for inviting me for this. It's exciting.
It is indeed. You know, one of the fun things we get to do here at Forbes Talks is go a little bit further back in time than a lot of my other interviews, which I always enjoy. In this case, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. Michael, where were you born? And tell us a little bit about mom and dad. Like, what kind of family did you grow up in? What did they do for a living? That sort of thing.
It's a great question. I think that's the furthest bet I've gotten into.
All right.
I'm born in Roskilde. Roskilde is this little city that's roughly half an hour in a train or in a car from Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm.
It's famous for its Roskilde Festival. That's the biggest North European festival. And where I live, you kind of hear it in the summertime. And I would also be, attending that when I was in high school and so on. So that was Roskilde. We lived in what would be like a typical suburban area, right? So it was like separate houses where, you would play on the street. You would play like anything from baseball to play football, hide and seek, other things.
And football is soccer now.
Football is soccer. That's one of the things I'll never get right. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Tell us about mom and dad. Were they entrepreneurs? Is this kind of a surprise to them that they've raised a CEO son, or like tell us a little bit about mom and dad.
Yes. So my dad was a banker.
Okay.
So he was like. It was kind of an interesting mix because in many ways it reflects what I'm doing today, right? Because basically he always wanted to be an engineer. He was born like a very poor family. They grew up in 7 kids with a lonely mom, one single mom. So it was like a pretty tough environment there. He was smart, so he got offered a job in a bank very early on, like when he was 14 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then he basically just stayed in the bank and worked there for all his life. Was doing mainly like on the private banking side, doing some of those clients, but he was like deep in numbers and doing that. But also what his passion were much more around like tech and other things.
Okay.
So that's what they call
very cool.
Yes.
And so like when you think back to those years growing up, is there like one sort of story that you think kind of demonstrates how young Michael was like doing something either for fun or with friends or at school that kind of like, that guy's going to grow up to found Chainalysis?
I think one of the things that I always obsessed about was like we had a workshop in the basement, like many houses would do that at that time, and friends where we would like take apart anything from scooters to bikes to other things, put them together again sometimes, and build things. But always this thing about like, let's construct something. And I had like, when I was a kid, I always had this like, let's do a patent about something. Let's do an innovation, like innovate something. Let's do an invention of something. And
literally a patent?
Yeah. So I've been like sending several ideas to the patent office until they got tired of me. So always had this idea of like
how
building
old were
something.
you when you did your first patent
the first
application?
One, 12 or 13,
so cool. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was kind of an engine.
Okay.
It was an engine with... I can't remember exactly the construct, but there was multiple cylinders and there was a smart thing about the gear. It turned out, they looked at it for a while and figured out it was already invented, and there were some issues with it that I kind of got later. Too high friction in the transmission system and another thing. But it was kind of fun to see that someone else has had the same idea. So then I got other ideas later.
So you fell in love with taking things apart, putting them together. You kind of like made the gateway into business through the intellectual property realm a little bit. What was the first thing that sort of happened that sort of led you to the world in crypto that you work in today?
Yeah, so I would say like back then as a kid, there was one key thing that happened. I got a computer. I got a Commodore 64.
Yes.
And suddenly I could start coding, right? And I realized that it scaled far better than standing in the workshop and putting things together. You could suddenly do basically magic with like build something from words, which is basically magic, right? So you could do that, write something and code come out and suddenly it could do things. And that was awesome. So I kind of got very excited about that, not for the computer in itself, but what it could be used for. So that was always the thing. And then like fast forward, I did my master's in chemistry. I did a PhD in quantum mechanics afterwards. Started working on virtual reality visualization initially.
What year roughly was that?
I got my PhD in 1998, I think.
Okay.
And then I did virtual reality for the next like 3 years or so.
Okay.
3D graphics, virtual reality stuff. Back then it was kind of required a supercomputer, but it was also the time where it went from supercomputing and into like normal computers. Cool. Started building distributed systems for virtual reality. That was kind of my first endeavor into distributed systems. And building, multiple screens, connected them together, could sync them up, do funny things there. Work with Danish broadcast organization.
Can you just expand? Because I've never actually heard virtual reality as sort of like a gateway drug to distributed systems. And like, for those of us, including myself, that don't know, can you give an example? Like, what was it exactly that was being distributed? Because I think that, especially now in the metaverse world and where virtual reality is getting more mature, the fact that that was your gateway is doubly interesting.
Yes, it was kind of, right? Because before that, I did quantum mechanics and big computers. There meant many computers and connecting those. So that's where I got my skills for distributed systems.
Got it.
But the whole point in virtual reality is that if you want to immerse yourself, you can put up like a heavy thing on your head, like HMD or something like that. And that was not really elegant and nice back then. But instead, you could build a lot of screens around you. You could have like 6 screens, like in a cube in a cave. You could have other things. But to run those with high resolution, you needed many graphic cards that you could bundle together. And as soon as you do that, you run into a lot of problems where they're out of sync and they don't match. And, the virtual reality suddenly becomes less reality. And that's really the challenge there. So then easily you get to like 24 machines, like 500 machines working together on one problem.
So that's awesome. There's a bunch of buzzwords there: distributed systems, graphics cards. I can almost feel how this is bringing you into the world of Bitcoin, but let's connect that final dot.
Yeah. So what happened in 2001, I was at a SIGGRAPH conference in Manchester, I think it was that year. And that's actually on 9/11.
Oh, wow.
So my colleagues from the US, they all get stuck there. It's like deeply moving. I'm standing there, but it's also basically the end of virtual reality in the first time around, because all the attention goes into, how should I put it, like national security concerns, other things. How do you do encryption of things, all of that. I then moved from virtual reality into grid computing. And grid computing is kind of the predecessor to cloud computing and was kind of born in the more academic sphere.
Okay.
I work closely with the particle accelerator at CERN, that project there, and I'm between the Nordic countries and Geneva all the time. Build out again distributed system for storage of all the data. So that one pumped out petabytes.
Just out of curiosity, this giant particle accelerator that crosses dozens of borders, you may get where I'm going here. Did you have to learn how to do any cross-jurisdictional work while you were there? Was there painting any trails between that and Chainalysis?
I think, well, kind of yes.
Okay.
Right? Actually, yes, because what happened there where I was coordinating the compute resources for 5-6 countries. And well, one of the participants in a network of like basically 50 countries that were working together on how we could like distribute the data and process it, all researchers worldwide, in this big system. So there was a lot of like cross-jurisdictional thing. There was a lot of politics involved, to be honest.
I can imagine, yeah.
One of the reasons why I left it. But yeah, that was kind of what happened there.
So, spoiler alert, you became Chief Operating Officer at Kraken. We're going to kind of skip that though. Because I want to get to what you're doing today.
Yes.
So how did you go from Kraken to co-founding Chainalysis? What was the demand that you saw? And just briefly walk us through that process.
So again, I basically been in distributed systems and big data all of my life. Like going back to whatever, it's always been big data. When I then looked at what happened in the crypto space in 2013, 14, and like even from 2011 and 12, I could see that there was a lack of data on like who are you transacting with, what's actually going on in this system. And every time there was like questions around what's going on in crypto, no one really had the answer. It was more like hearsays, and you could ask specific companies how many wallets they created, and you didn't really know whether they were telling the truth or whether they wanted to pump up the numbers. What was actually going on?
Yeah.
And I kind of knew that crypto had this amazing property that you basically see. It was completely transparent. All the transactions were written in the blockchain. It was just a matter of like, how do you analyze it to actually build a knowledge graph around it. So I was kind of thinking and mulling over that over the early years in crypto, and see that was something that someone should do at some point. I just imagined that someone else would do it, that I wouldn't do it, right? So I kind of needed that in the summer of 2013 when I was at Kraken, because that was a time where regulators, was it 14? That was probably summer of 2014.
Yeah.
Regulators started to say, like, this thing, it's like very, very opaque. And I told them, no, it's very, very transparent. And I said, like, but it's not. I can't see it. So it's not transparent to me. That was kind of the thing. So that was a time where I felt like I could solve a lot of problems in crypto, a lot of the friction that we saw from getting bank accounts, from the perceived like criminal activity in the crypto space and so on, measure it and do a lot of those things by basically building a knowledge graph on crypto that could show what is actually going on.
I'd love to briefly go into that process of building the knowledge graph in the early days, because I think it's really interesting, sort of like how you guys bootstrapped yourselves, how you were able to do this kind of like the old-fashioned way early on. I remember as a reporter, like every time anybody posted a public address on Reddit, I was going in there and copying it and putting their name next to it. And I had a little spreadsheet of, everyone's public addresses so I could see what they were doing.
Yeah.
Like in those early days, like when it was theoretically transparent, but the technology didn't exist to really probe the blockchain in any sophisticated way, like how did you guys kind of bootstrap yourselves and get that first data to the point where you could like then go and start raising capital?
So I would say one of the key things that happened there, I got engaged by the Mt. Gox bankruptcy trustee to basically figure out what happened to Mt. Gox.
Yeah.
So that also,
this was Mt. Gox, $500 million of Bitcoin that was hacked from an exchange. One of the early sort of instances where non-Bitcoiners started declaring the death of Bitcoin, and you were brought in to sort of help with that.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was basically because I was like, at that point, kind of understood how you could maybe do an investigation without really knowing anything about it at that point, right? And then brought in to look at the database. The first assumption were that it was all an insider job, so it had happened at the exchange, right? So I get access to the database, look in that one, only to figure out that I need the blockchain as well. And the interesting thing here is basically that, like, getting access to the Mt. Gox database, it was leaked later, so that meant that I could also use it for other purposes because now it was public data. But basically that gave access to hundreds of thousands of like data points into the crypto space. Anything from services to individuals to a lot of other things. So you could basically map out what happens in crypto. So that was a good bootstrapping.
Very cool.
We also, so basically that's been one of the key things, like working on that case. And then basically we got like from law enforcement, they would ask, what about this? What about that?
So you were so early that there wasn't a whole lot of people to go to. No. So you had the advantage of being one of the very few games in town that law enforcement could go to. Yeah. Fascinating. So I do want to come forward to today. So let's do just a quick top down. We've talked about kind of how you got to here, but what is Chainalysis today? Give like, where are you based? How many employees do you have? What kind of services do you provide?
Yeah, so we are based out of New York. That's our headquarter. And then we have offices in probably like roughly 10 other locations, anything from 2 or 3 offices in Asia, Seoul, Singapore, to different locations in Europe, with Copenhagen being one of them, London, Amsterdam, and then we have a couple of places here in the US where New York was one, and then of course DC is like a major hub for us, mainly because of the customers. Chainalysis, what are we doing and how does it work?
Yeah.
So the core thing is kind of our data platform. So we have a data platform which is basically the knowledge graph. It contains a knowledge graph with all the attributions and so on.
It's a spreadsheet with a bunch of addresses, right?
It is. It's a big spreadsheet, but it's basically what it is, right? And then that's searchable and indexed and a lot of other things, and we can build products on top of that. So the earliest product we built was Reactor. Reactor is like an investigation product where you can take a part of the knowledge graph, that becomes your investigation. So the graph you see in Reactor is nothing but a part of the knowledge graph of the entire crypto space. And that's an interesting thing because that's how all investigations are basically made. Then we have KYT, Know Your Transaction. That's automating transaction monitoring for crypto businesses. So they receive a transfer from somewhere and they can immediately say, oh, that came from another exchange, run out of the Netherlands, and all things are good here. Or they could say, that actually looks like the user was donating money to terrorists in an obscure country somewhere in the world, and we're a little bit concerned about this and probably need to file a report. So these things can be informed on an automated basis.
I want to clarify something you said there. Are you proactively taking potentially hot or black wallets to law enforcement, or are you waiting until they come to you with addresses?
It's a complicated thing, right? We work with 200 public sector institutions in 50 countries.
Okay.
And all of
200 what? I'm sorry.
Public sector institutions.
Oh, okay.
So like
okay.
anything that has a 3-letter acronym around the globe, basically, right?
And not just in the States.
Not just in the States. It's 50 countries around the world. So what happens in these relationships is, of course, that we have a mixture of sales reps that sell software to investigators that basically assist and train the investigators there. And in that collaboration, it's kind of hard to say what we're not really shopping a thing to law enforcement, but at the same time, we sit together and they say, we're looking at something like this, and we say, like, oh, is that you mean? We actually know what that is, and we can tell you that piece, right? So it's kind of a mixture. So we're not shopping things around. I think the only thing we shopped was when my fiance got her Instagram account hacked, and I said, like, can you please help find arrest that guy?
That's fair.
So yeah, otherwise we haven't really shopped up yet.
Very cool. So like, how much demand is there for your services? Like on any given day today, like, do you know how many investigations are currently underway, or give like a window, like,
wow,
10, 100,
we have
1,000?
thousands of users,
Okay.
and that means they probably have thousands of investigations going on.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And so you won't necessarily hands-on help with every investigation. You're providing software so that these government agencies can do their own investigations.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Is there like a white glove tiered service where I can like call up Michael and say, hey, I need your smartest computer scientist or you to come take a look at this?
Yeah, I'm not the smartest computer scientist anymore, but like definitely there's a helpline there as well. And again, it's a mixture of training to services, right? Where it's a very typical scenario for any B2B SaaS company that you need some help, you need some guidance, and also it's extremely important to me that people don't get it wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a complicated thing to do crypto investigations, and you can easily make the wrong conclusions. You definitely want to ensure that you have
Has a wrong conclusion ever been reached that resulted in blowback for you guys, even if you weren't hands-on?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay,
no,
okay,
Not
okay.
to my knowledge.
So you're like pretty proactive. Like, do you like review final reports before they go out? Like,
so that was kind of that was what created the sales motion we have today, where there's a mixture of services and other things. So in the early days, I would like sit with a law enforcement officer, give him access to Reactor. He would do an investigation, and then like 2 months later, I would say like, hey, Michael, can you fly by and like sit next to me and then I walk you through something just to see if I got it right. And then I would sit next to him and say, like, yeah, that's right. This is correct. This looks like what I would conclude as well, and that makes sense. And sometimes I didn't have the full context, and sometimes I knew a little bit more. But it would more be like, am I doing it right? Yes. And then there would be a situation where someone comes to me like super excited. This looks like this, and like, nah, it's actually not, because this is two different wallets and not the same. It could look like it, but it's not really. So I don't think you can conclude that. And then I might dive a little bit deeper and see if there was another lead that pointed to that. And I was like, no, that's not the case.
Fascinating. So I'd like to. We'll just use the functional number, thousands of investigations on any given day. Like, can we break those down into any sort of interesting categories? The first one that jumped out to me was like, is there any sort of sense as to like whether or not a licensed entity, a regulated entity, might have higher or lower likelihood of, having illicit or illegal activity going on? Like, is it like 20% licensed, 80% unlicensed? Is there any sort of connection where we can kind of like break down those investigations into smaller data sets?
It's hard to be because we don't really know what customers are doing exactly.
Fair.
Right? So we have like some categories. We hear it like anecdotally from what they would raise with us, right? Of investigations. I would say that like when you look at what happens in crypto crime in general, it's probably a pretty good assessment here. Except that like I don't think that scams is huge, but again I don't think that there's the same kind of like we care deeply about scams from law enforcement because it's not critical infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah.
So what is the most concerning thing? Critical infrastructure, nation state actors.
Yes.
There'll be a lot of resources dedicated to that. Then you have different kind of trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking as well. There'll be some resources dedicated to that. And then you have other things like crypto hacks. Sometimes they're infrastructure, like nation state actors. Sometimes they're a little bit just, random dude in a basement that stole some money and then law enforcement is involved.
That's an interesting point. So like we hear a lot about nation state actors. I'll throw one out there that's mentioned frequently, North Korea. Like, are we talking, when we hear about North Korea doing something illegal or illicit, are we talking about the government proactively doing something, or are we talking about a rogue government, to use the U.S. term, that is allowing other people to do these attacks?
Yeah, so there's two kinds, right? So as you basically say, there's the letter of marque, where it's like I'm a pirate and I'm allowed to by my government and I can keep the loot.
Great example.
That's one example, right? That's typically Russia. Right, the Russian cyber criminals have operated that way for a long time, down to the thing where if they deployed malware on your phone, it would not be malware if you had your phone set to Russian. Pretty simple, right? So then you're definitely sure you don't hit Russians, so then it's fine. And that's typically the Russian scenario. If you then
so that's this is what old-fashioned privateer. They're not criminals as long as they're not going after their own country's boats.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And they can keep the loot. That's kind of the whole point, right? Okay. And it hurts everyone else, but not your own country, which is kind of what happens.
Okay.
Then you look at North Korea. North Korea is a way more targeted operation, and it's like there's a group around it. It's like government sponsored. It's also an important part of their raising money, right? If you look at North Korea, the GDP is pretty low, and crypto crime is probably like 10%, if not more.
If not more, yeah.
So it's a huge amount, and that goes to fund nuclear weapons, right? And basically, it's a way for them to steal from critical infrastructure in the crypto space from financial institutions. They did it in the past as well. We've seen hacks of banks and other things. So it's not that just crypto, but they've been very targeted at basically stealing to avoid sanctions and basically get dollars.
As I understand it, like, please correct me if I'm wrong, but just in the interest of time, like, you guys kind of think of yourselves as part of the crypto industry. Like, you are rooting for it,
100%.
You want to see it succeed. Like, when you do like a cost benefit analysis, especially with your quantum physics brain, I'm going to ask you to run these numbers real quick, like, and you look at sort of like the benefits or even the potential benefits of crypto to society versus the costs of like North Korea raising funds for nuclear weapons. Like, at what point do you start to wonder if maybe the cost benefit is starting to go a little askew there?
So I think that can often be the general perception there. I think it's completely wrong. So like, again, the amount of criminal activity happening in crypto is counted in basis points.
Yeah.
So it's not really something that's like a huge problem. It's of course in dollars a huge problem. But the way I look at crypto is that this is suddenly cybercrime that got a money trail. So before, cybercrime was basically impossible to investigate. It was super hard because everything was like basically ephemeral data. So like you hit up a server, you go to a router, data is gone. We try to do logging. There was a lot of talk about like keep logs for years. Back after 9/11, a lot of pushback from privacy advocates, including me, that you should not keep logs that long. And now you have something that's written forever. The blockchain, the money trail. Just like we solved crimes for like decades and decades and decades. And now you can do that in cybercrime as well. Which for me is like a huge win rather than anything else.
I want to talk about trends. And like, you have rare, if not unique, insight into trends. But like, I want to know about the trends of the criminals. right? Like, are you seeing, like, last year we heard a lot of pig butchering stories. In fact, the Forbes innovation team, my colleagues deserve a big hat tip for doing awesome work on some pig butchering reporting. But like, wait, what's the biggest trend among criminals right now that investigators and maybe even entrepreneurs or bankers should be paying attention to?
I think you need to divide it up a bit, right?
Okay.
Because I think again, there's the stuff that's again national security related. That's like hack of critical infrastructure, ransomware against critical infrastructure, and other things. It's still a big problem and something that's deeply concerning. And if you see governments saying like we are concerned about ransomware, they actually mean specifically ransomware against critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's not about $300 you are paying to unlock your computer.
Yeah.
It's like that's nothing. But the reason why I brought that up again, that is huge as well. And that's growing because there's virtually no investigations against it. So everything that you look at, like all the smaller things that aggregates up, that's a big problem. That's also why pig butchering is like a problem because again, it's smaller cases.
Very quickly, I know I used the term and I didn't define it, journalism rule break 101, but for those that don't know, what is pig butchering?
It's basically, you get some typically a guy in a situation that's somewhat embarrassing, whether he thinks he talks to a minor or whatever it is, and then you start to blackmail the person afterwards.
Okay,
yes,
cool.
Yes, that's why it's called pig butchering and whatever. Yeah.
What's the biggest vulnerability to businesses?
To businesses, I would still say it's ransomware.
It is still ransomware.
Yeah.
And that's infrastructure ransomware.
Infrastructure.
You're a hospital, you can't get access to your patient files unless you give.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that changing? Is that always the biggest threat, or do the threats cycle?
So I think it's kind of still the thing. I would say the other thing is if you're a crypto business, then I would say hacks where you steal your funds, whether you're a DeFi player, whether you are a crypto exchange, is also a problem. I would add to that though that the centralized exchanges have gone like far better over the last 5 years in terms of like protecting themselves, where DeFi is like a young industry. There's a lot of hardening and knowledge to be built up, and we've seen some issues with that last year. We haven't seen that to the same extent this year, which could kind of point towards that maybe there's a better standard now, so we'll be protected against that.
Now, Chainalysis, by and large, as a journalist, I pride myself in having an unbiased perspective. So if I say that a company has a pretty good reputation, that means they have a pretty good reputation, and it's not an endorsement. It was interesting though, recently, for maybe the first time ever, I did see a kind of negative headline come out about Chainalysis regarding Bitcoin fog. The lawyers at Bitcoin Fog are trying to use what they describe, and I wrote it down, faulty digital forensics is their claim to try and get their client out of jail where he's been for 2 years. I don't know if you want to address that directly or generally speaking, but like this idea of faulty digital forensics maybe being like a hole that people could attack. Like, how do you prevent that from happening?
I would say, I'll not go into the specific case, right? But I think that like what happens in crypto investigations is that this is not the only lead. This is not the only thing, right? But it could, for example, mean that like if you have figured out that someone might be doing something bad using cryptocurrencies and you figured out the name and other things, that might warrant for house search for other things, for like looking into their bank account statements, to looking into their life, to arresting them and other things, but it would not lead to them actually getting convicted. So these are just like a small part of an investigation where you use them for leads and lead generation into cases. And then in few situations like where it's like extremely good evidence on the crypto side, then it might be a bigger part of a case. But mostly this is just a part of everything, right? So it's the same as happens in the digital space all the time, where, well, you looked at a site you shouldn't look at, and suddenly someone looks at your computer. They don't just put you in jail. Now they go and find your computer and figure out you have pictures you should not have in that computer, and you have things there. And now they have a case, but they don't have a case just because they saw something in a log, right?
So last question on this line, and then we'll wrap it up. I want to try and identify some trends looking to the future, or one big trend. But as a follow up to that, I'm very curious. do you ever, because you're a data providing company, basically, right? Do you know, like, do different sides of the same case ever use your software to like go at each other? Like, are there like non-compete disclosure, like preventions there? Like, how does that work if a prosecutor and a defendant are both using Chainalysis? Is that okay?
So I would put it this way, that like there are different things to prevent this, right? So first of all, well, you can look at just law enforcement. In the US, there's dozens of law enforcement agencies, and there'll be competition between them of cases. And sometimes they realize they're looking at the same case, and they have a deconfliction protocol to solve that themselves, so that's fine. But there will be times where, yes, the same case might be run by different agencies, and sometimes if our investigators know about it, it's like, hey, you should talk to
call
Bob.
them up, like, hey, just so you know, maybe
you should talk to Bob as well, right? Yeah, that's kind of how it is. That's pretty like mundane, nothing bad there. Then if you look at like the way we structure Chainalysis today, is that we have Chainalysis Government Solutions. That's dedicated part of the organization that deal with basically U.S. law enforcement and U.S. intelligence agencies and so on. And basically that side is like, I don't even know what's going on because I'm Danish, and hence I cannot know that, which is fine. But it also means that we separate that out. So that's a part where maybe something goes on one side here and maybe it goes on the other side here. I can't tell, but also we have basically ensured that there's no conflict because there's a Chinese wall between them.
Love it. Last question. I want to try and look at one macro trend. And it's the only one that most people care about, which is Bitcoin is for crime. And I love your annual reports. I read them every year. When we can, we try and cover them because there's a lot of good data there. But was it last year? I know very, very recently we had a record year for the highest percentage of criminal activity ever on crypto. What was the percentage there?
So we went from I only remember them to the round numbers.
Yeah, that's
right?
fine.
So it's
that's
like
fine.
from 15 basis points to 24 basis points, 25 basis points, right? So last year was 25 basis points, and that was of course because the volume in crypto is growing year by year. It's still in terms of dollars. That's a lot of money that was happening.
Yeah.
The main driver last year was sanctions. So again, because a lot of sites, like anything from Tornado Cash to Russian exchanges, got sanctioned due to the war in Ukraine, that basically added another, at least 10 basis points on top of everything. There was the same businesses, the same volume a year before, but a year before it was
fascinating.
Not criminal.
So with that said, with an eye to the future, when you look at the macro geopolitical landscape today, what are you keeping an eye on for next year?
So I would say, I think the trends will be continuously like that. The crypto crime will stay relatively low, like on that order of magnitude. But again, if I look at the world, it's like you have a world that's like being increasingly divided, and that can make crypto crime look higher because of sanctions. Because again, if we sanction more things seen from the US point of view, well, that would just be criminal. So I think that's kind of the heads up to where I'll be watching that
using Bitcoin to buy bread in
Yeah.
North Korea is now illegal activity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fascinating. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. Looking forward to seeing what you guys do next.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.